this interaction and discussion, I think what we choose to talk is about the financial market in Africa, and mainly the stock market in Tanzania, the experience they have. For me, in West Africa, we have, as I said in the morning, we have one community, monetary union in West Africa, and we have one stock market also, is in Abidjan. We call it marché financier in French. Marché financier is a stock market for 8 countries, so in Abidjan. But we have another experience here from Tanzania. They have their own stock market. I think it's very interesting to talk with the CEO. They can explain a little bit how they work and how they think is running. As you know, one of the first cooperation in Africa with Asia, mainly with China, is in Tanzania and Zambia. The first cooperation in Africa. When the Chinese begin to enter in Africa for cooperation, they begin in those countries first. Is in the 60s.
That's right.
They begin in the infrastructure, building the infrastructure in Africa, railroad and the roads, etc., etc. So we have a CEO here. He has a very good experience in all this cooperation, also in the financial sector. And thanks to the former Prime Minister of Armenia, who is the professor in economics, can help us a lot with his experience, and we can learn also from him in this session. Thank you, Mr. Moremi.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. As you can see, I've just arrived, so I haven't even changed. And yes, so you excuse my attire. I think since the discussion is about the financial markets in general, and sharing my experience running the stock exchange in Tanzania, normally what is expected is that the financial market, which includes the banking space as well as the capital market, should be the engine of economic development for any country. And then we have the fiscal side of things, which is the government with its taxes and spending and all that. But the private sector for sustainability and longevity of investments and expectations of those investments when it comes to those who have invested in different asset classes is the financial market in general. So the banking side as well as the capital market side. In both, there has been some developments in Africa in general, especially in the past 20 years. There are a lot of harmonization and integration of markets to provide a more wider investor base for different projects as well as enterprises that can be established, and this which requires both short-term to medium as well as long-term sources of financing. Now, for short-term and medium, which normally is obtained from the banking side, the development, to my view, is more significant compared to the development in the capital market, which is the source of long-term capital for infrastructure as well as enterprise development and growth. And given the level of integration and harmonization in different blocks in Africa, and there are those blocks, for example, for us in East Africa, the part of the eastern part of Africa, we have our own bloc called the East African Community, whose secretariat is in my country, in Tanzania. And they are championing matters related to market integration as well as harmonization of the legal and regulatory framework, so that as the market we can work as a bloc instead of each single country, given the size of our economies and the size of investors in our markets. But also we are harmonizing in the southern part of Africa, where Tanzania is also part of that. It's called SADC, the Southern Africa Development Corporation, in which we are also part of it. It's another block which also looks for market integration and harmonization of the legal and regulatory framework, again with the same purpose of making sure that we have a bigger market. For the East Africa, for example, if you take Tanzania as a country, we are 44 million people. But if you take the whole of East Africa, which includes Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, and Burundi, then you have a market of almost 120. Now, for an investor, whether a local investor or a foreign investor who is looking at the market, they will prefer to see a bigger market. So if you talk about the market whose population is 120, it makes sense to them compared to an economy whose population is 54. And these are economies which they are not even in the frontier or emerging or developed. Most of them, they are still in the developing stage, where per capita income is less than $1,000 per annum. So the spending power is not relatively bigger. So unless you increase the size of the market via integration, as well as the size of the source of financing and where that financing will go, if that is a miss, then you have problems. So yeah, there has been those integration and harmonization so that to increase the investor base, but also to increase the size of the markets. In the development side of the financial space, as I said, there has been some development, even for single countries. For us, for example, as a stock market, I joined the Dar es Salaam Stock Exchange 5 years ago. At that time, our market capitalization, meaning the size of the market, was around $7 billion at that time. And 5 years down the line, the number of enterprises that have listed in the stock market in terms of both equities, meaning shares, but also in the fixed income space, meaning bonds, corporate bonds as well as government bonds, they both have increased significantly. So currently our market cap, the market capitalization of our stock market, is almost $12 billion, which is 12 billion. Yes, US dollars, which is around 22% of the GDP, the size of our economy, which is around 50 billion US dollars. And that is in the equity side. On the fixed income side, which is bonds, mainly issued by the government, they are worth around 4 billion US dollars. And then you have here and there corporate entities which are private sector related, which sometimes they also issue bonds in order to finance their long-term assets. And especially these will be banks. They want to match their liabilities versus their assets. So if they are lending long-term in projects such as infrastructure or in industries or agriculture, which normally will be for long-term, as well as real estates, which is long-term kind of assets, they also need funding, which is long-term, and that cannot be achieved via customers' deposits and savings. They have to use long-term instruments such as corporate bonds in order to mobilize that kind of financing to be able to finance projects such as infrastructure, industries, agriculture, real estates. So that has been our experience. But also the other aspect, which normally is an important aspect when you are talking about the capital market, is the liquidity in the market. Is the market liquid? So an investor from outside the country, they will want to have the confidence that when they put their money in the market, when they want to exit, it should be easy for them to, number one, sell their position, as well as there has to be minimal exchange controls related to expatriation of capital as well as profit. So in terms of liquidity, 5 years ago, I remember our liquidity to compared to the market capitalization was in the range of less than 2%, but now we are at the level which is close to 10%, both on the equity side but also on the fixed income side. So these are, to us, they are major developments in terms of giving both local investors as well as foreign investors the confidence to come into the market. And on the legal and regulatory framework, in order to enable that, we used to have foreign investors limits. So if a company wants to raise capital from the capital market, foreign investors will be allowed to invest in that company up to a certain level in order to give room to local investors as part of economic empowerment to citizens and financial inclusion. You have to allow them to also take a position in a company. Otherwise, foreign investors will be more interested and locals will not get a chance. So there was an aspect of protectionism for local investors. But then we decided to get away with that. And 3 years ago, we uplifted those foreign investors limit. So currently, foreign investors from wherever, they can invest as much as locals they invest. So they have also fiscal incentives, the tax incentives which are provided to investors. They apply to both local as they are for foreigners. And we don't have foreign investors controls in terms of capital repatriation, but also profit repatriation. So you invest as a local investor will do, and if you want to sell your position and get your money back, it's as easy as it is to local investors. And these have resulted into an increase in liquidity, but also increase in money that comes into the economy, which then goes into financing different economic activities, being infrastructure or industrial development, as well as other projects that will need to attract portfolio funding to go and finance them. I think I'll stop there, and then if there will be some questions, we'll take some questions.
Yeah, thank you. I think there are some important things the CEO talk, but I want also to give you some facts about this financial market and the financial situation in Africa. For example, in Kenya, exactly, which is well known. Access of credit in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, is very low. They said that to have access to bank and to have a loan is so difficult because of the infrastructure. So you cannot do it in an easy way. But what happened now? With technology, people are changing, jumping some steps. Now, for example, in Kenya in 2011, for example, I have some data here. 42% of population have a bank account. In 2014, it's 80%. Why? Because the technology. They are using now what we call money bank account with mobile phone. So this mobile phone, they are revolutioning Africa, and they are allowing people to have easily bank account and to have loans. So because of technology, we are jumping to go to another step. Because you cannot have a loans, you cannot have a credit if you don't have account. How can I give you money, you don't have the minimum infrastructure in order to get back the money. So this is very, very important because of the lack of the infrastructure, because of the geography of the country. But the mobile phone, you can now, I can say in Africa, the rate of the penetration of mobile phone is so high that practically everybody has his a mobile phone. You go in the way, I don't know, far where you cannot imagine that you can find people here communicating, you will find him there with a solar charger and charging his phone and his mobile account working, etc., etc. This is very, very interesting, and it is a step to that we think that we can create account for everybody, because we cannot continue using physical money working everywhere with this.
It's true.
I don't know the experience, the CEO, maybe he can talk also about this in Tanzania, in East Africa, how it works.
I think you are right in what you have just indicated, and this is the necessity of private sector as well as public sector working together. So if what has been happening in the telecommunication space can be replicated in other areas in the infrastructure, even in the infrastructure space, whether in the road or ports or airports, relative to what has happened in the telecommunication sector, then we might see some more developments in Africa. And normally when we have interaction with political leaders in the continent, for us from the business side of things, we normally tend to encourage the need for PPPs, meaning the private and public sector working together in partnership for economic development. So back to what has happened with the telecommunication space. Previously, people couldn't access financial services because they are provided by banks. And if you go by the model of, going to a branch and the building is there, and therefore you go and open an account physically. And given the challenges related to infrastructure in Africa, where moving from one space, one place to another, it's a major challenge. Some places are not reachable because roads are not passable throughout the year. So how can somebody go to a major city to open an account where they are living in the village? But with the telecommunication, especially mobile telecommunication, nowadays people, they use their phone to bank, but also to transact. So for me, for example, my relatives are living in the village and they don't have a bank account. But if I want to send money, then I just use my mobile phone, and which is loaded. They call it pocket wallet phone, where you put your money in the phone, and anytime you want to do some transaction, if you want to buy some utilities, you want to buy, for example, you pay for water or you pay for electricity, or you go to a grocery to buy some stuff, you don't have to pay by cash. You just use your mobile wallet to pay for those expenses. If you want to send money to your relatives in the village, they don't have to go to a bank. You just use the phone, you send the money, and they can go and cash to a mobile money operator. And these are located across the country. Even in the villages, they are there. So if they want to use money to buy stuff, they can do that. If they want to cash using their mobile wallet, they can do that. So that has been extended even in the capital market. For us at the Dar es Salaam Stock Exchange now, we allow people to buy shares and bonds using their mobile phone as well. So you place an order with a broker using your mobile phone, and the broker will come to the stock exchange to buy those shares on behalf of the clients who are investors. And when the investor wants to sell, they just put an order through their mobile phone to a broker who will sell and then transfer funds to their account using the mobile phone. And this takes just 3 days for a transaction to be completed, compared to previously where brokers are mainly situated in the city, which is Dar es Salaam. But we have a big country, and people can't move from a village somewhere to come to Dar es Salaam to place an order with a broker for them to go and buy their shares. The cost of transaction will be too high. But with a mobile phone, they don't need to move going anywhere. You are just sitting in your living room in the village, and you place an order with a broker who will then transact for you and remit money for you. So this is a major development in the telecommunication space when it relates to financial markets. And the challenge for us in Africa, whether coming from the business side of things or from the political side of things, or from the policy side of things, is to now replicate what we have done with the telecommunication sector as it relates to financial markets in these past almost 20 years now, and go into the other areas. Again, whether it's in road or railway or ports or airports, because infrastructure is very important for any economic development. So if the private sector and public sector can work in partnership for these objectives, then the level of development and growth that we want to see in Africa will be relatively higher and stronger compared to where we are.
Yeah, thank you. Questions? Prime Minister.
I have a couple of questions. First of all, what is the size of the banking system in Tanzania? I mean, the assets versus GDP. And my second question is connected with this PPP practice.
Yeah.
What is the average percentage when a private investor is putting money with the participation of the government? What is the average percentage? What shows your experience, in terms of efficiency of such investment?
Okay. To respond to your first question, Prime Minister, the size of the banking in Tanzania relative to the size of the economy, which is GDP, is around 30%, because our 30%, 30, yes.
$15 billion.
Yeah, 15 billion dollars. Yes, $15 billion relative to the $50 billion of GDP. Yes, so that's where we are in, and that is significant compared to what the situation was a few years ago. However, the compounded annual growth rate of the banking sector has been relatively faster. Almost our GDP is growing at around 70% per annum for the past 2 decades. So from the start of the century up to now, our annual economic growth has been at the level of 70%, which is one of the highest, not only in Africa, but in the world as well. So given the GDP growth of 7%, but the banking sector has been growing at almost 15% during this same period. So that pace of growth and how it's used to finance economic development or economic activities, we think we might see some better outcomes even in the future. And most of these banks, they are foreign direct investments. So we have banks like the Barclays, Standard Chartered, Standard Bank, Citibank, making almost 50% of the total of the balance sheet size of the banking sector in Tanzania. And then the remaining will be regional banks as well as the local banks. On your second question, on what is the investors' return on these PPP projects, as you will imagine, it depends on the sector. The level of risk that you tend to take in some of the sectors will be relatively higher, and therefore their returns are also expected to be higher compared to others. Now, putting the weighted average return will be difficult. But what I can tell you is that in the services sector, so meaning airline, banking, telecommunication, the kind of return has been at the level which is, especially for those which are also listed in the stock market, which is easy for me to say, has been at the level of more than 15% of return to investors. If you combine the capital gain as well as dividends, those are the levels. On infrastructure, the returns are even more higher because, again, the level of risk which is taken and the longevity of their projects is long. So the level has been beyond 20% for those kinds of investments. And for them, mostly will be investments in terms of buying bonds, infrastructure bonds, which are issued by the government, which then gives the return of around 18 to 20% on those instruments. And since they are governments, then the level of risk is relatively lower because at least the government bonds, also called treasury bonds, they are, the risk is relatively lower because the government wouldn't want to default on their obligations. So those are the kind of returns which investors are getting, whether you are a foreign investor or a local investor. And then there are fiscal incentives, as I said. There are no taxes, for example, on capital gain for listed securities, which are listed in the stock market. So there are no capital gain tax. Also, there's no withholding tax on interest, which are earned by bonds which are issued and listed in the stock market if their maturity is more than 2 years. So these are some of the benefits which some of the foreign investors which I've seen taking a space in our market has been benefiting. And these foreign investors will normally come from the US, mainly pension funds and other asset managers, as well as some asset managers from Europe as well.
Just to be continued, if I may.
Yeah, absolutely.
18 or 20% is too much, It will be very difficult for you to mature to such a debt, with bonds, Your external debt must grow up for a long run very fastly. It will create in 5, 7, or 10 years from now a very big problem for the country to return to this point. And the second issue is just a remark. If I'm right, China was constructing railway, yes?
Yeah.
In Tanzania. Does it work? How you pay for this job to Chinese people?
Okay.
I remember that they were opening some, or they are doing constructing, or they were opening some big railway,
Yeah.
even connecting Kenya with
Tanzania and all that.
Salaam,
Yeah. Yeah. On the first question, it's a complex trade-off on that, because people from the private sector, if the government is taking money at 18% to 20%, and given the risk premium that a private sector will want to take the same money from investors, then the private sector will have to borrow at the range which is more than the 18 to 20% normally. And that is a big trade-off in our market when it comes to, government needing money and the private sector needing money for development. And the private sector have been saying they are being crowded out because the government is at the front needing money for infrastructure development. And if the government is taking money at 18%, then the private sector has to take at more than 20% because of the risk premium that they will need to put on a risk-free instrument such as a treasury bill or a treasury bond. And what I've seen the government trying to do with the central bank is to try and change their auction model from the quantum-based auction model where they target to get a certain amount of money versus a pricing auction model, which is they set a target like the US and some of the European countries do. So when they auction their treasury bills or treasury bonds, they will say we want to take money at a certain level of coupon. So you give us whatever you can, but at this interest rate, compared to the previous auction model where the government will say we need 100 billion, and therefore just quote the price that you want for you to give us the 100 billion. And I think that model, which I think they've been advised by the World Bank and the IMF, will kick in the second half of the year. So that will assist in bringing down the interest rates. And at that time, the private sector will now see the benefit of also coming in because interest rates will have decreased. These are some of the intricacies and difficulties which economies in some of the African countries are finding themselves into. Now, on your second question, yes, there are a lot of infrastructure development projects which are being now pioneered in Tanzania, especially with the current government, which came to power about 2 years ago by our president, who is now known almost all over the world in cracking down corruption, bringing about probably good governance, as well as championing government spending in infrastructure. So he doesn't have much trust in the private sector, I think. He believes in government role in economic development. So some of the projects which the government is pushing include the standard gauge railway, which is a huge project, $7 billion project that will link Tanzania with Rwanda and Burundi and DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. That project is now being under construction with contractors from Turkey as well as China. But there's also another project which is to build another port apart from Dar es Salaam. There's another city, town close to Dar es Salaam called Bagamoyo. So the Chinese putting a major project there, $3 billion worth of a project to expand that port. And also there are a lot of road infrastructure projects which are ongoing in the market, but these are funded locally using local funds. But for the two, the port as well as the standard gauge railway, that is financed by the Chinese as well as Turkeys. In terms of return, because these are much as they are public projects in terms of their government projects, but they are financed privately with private banks from China. Sometimes the Chinese private banks, they are also government banks, but for us, we consider them as private funding. And for those, it's difficult for me to say because they are not publicly traded and therefore not transparent in terms of understanding what kind of pricing and cost of funding which is there. But there are huge projects in there. Yeah.
Thank you. More question? Yes.
Joseph from California, United States. Thank you, officer, for coming in today. It was reported today that of all the CEOs in Tanzania, only 8% are female. And what is being done for the culture of Tanzania to create better equality for women, as well as from your perspective as a leader in the business world?
Okay, thank you. As I was coming here today at the stock exchange back in Tanzania, as it is for other 60 stock exchanges in the world, we were ringing the bell for gender equality. Today is the Women Day, as you know, and at the stock exchange in Tanzania, we were collaborating with the UN Women, UN Global Impact, UN Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative, which came as part of the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as the World Federation of Exchanges to bring the awareness and sensitize the need for gender equality when it comes to running big organizations which are also listed in the stock exchange. So what we were doing today, much as I wasn't there, I was supposed to give a speech there, but I was on the way coming here, is that we for us in the stock market and for companies which are listed in the stock market, including myself, because the Dar es Salaam Stock Exchange is also listed in its own exchange, what we try to do is to be sensitive enough to the fact that, and especially in Africa, where some of the cultural aspects in our space excludes women in participating in economic activities. Now that's bad, because by doing that you exclude a big chunk of the resources that will go to inject human resources and bring about the economic development that we expect to see. And what we are doing today, like we did last year with the Ring the Bell for gender equality, is to bring out these voices to become more sensitive and more cautious when it comes to the issue of inclusiveness in running corporates, but also in bringing in more women in terms of on employment but also ensuring that as women are employed, they get a fair share of their compensation for the amount of work which they put on the job that they are doing. And we think it's a necessary aspect in our societies to try and appreciate the role of women in economic development, especially in our countries where these issues sometimes are difficult. Now, to be specific to your question, what are we doing in making sure that more women are becoming CEOs and running entities? That's a difficult one. That's a very difficult question to respond. Because other than trying to encourage, trying to bring awareness, trying to sensitize, issues of employment, they go to, attracting good talent that will go to to maximize the economic return which are expected from investors who puts money in their company. So whether you are a man or a woman, it doesn't matter, as long as in the corporate world, and especially the market-based economic model, profit maximization is one of the key ingredients. And people want a CEO that will go and maximize their investment return. So whether you're a man or a woman, it doesn't matter. But with the initiative which I said, we are trying to also bring the awareness of inclusiveness of women and equality of treatment of women when it comes to business and economic development aspects of our lives.
Yeah, thank you. More questions? Somebody want to ask questions? Okay. Yes.
Hi, my name is Alexa. I'm from Germany. A follow-up to what you were just saying, that it's all about the qualifications that you bring with you so you can do a good job in a market-based performance job. Considering the goal is equality between men and women, can you say anything about the level of schooling and the equality of schooling, especially on a university level, between men and women in your country? Because that is a deciding factor in whether or not qualified women can apply for the jobs.
Oh, okay. Previously, for some of the tribes in Tanzania, for example, the commonly known the Maasais, women were not part of these issues of education. So normally they will stay at home. Even my tribe, we are called the Kuria. Also, women were not given the chance to go to school, even at primary school. But that has been changing, where currently, whether the Maasai or the Kuria or some other tribes coming from that part of the world, the government has been putting more emphasis to make sure that girls are given equal chances for education as it is for men. And therefore, girls' enrollment in primary schools and secondary schools and universities has been increasing at a significant pace compared to how it was. So as we become part of the globalized world and we become more enlightened with what is happening in other parts of the world and the role of women in social and economic activities and their relevance, if we want to have an inclusive growth, then we are learning and we are taking those lessons back to our places. And we have been some significant development recently in terms of women, our girls' enrollment on different levels of education.
Yeah, thank you. I think we are on time. Thank you, CEO of Tanzania Stock Exchange. And what we talk about technology, I think it can help a lot, not only the men but the women also, to enter in this market, financial market, and to have more loan and to implement more projects, individual project. And I saw some figures about this transfer money in Kenya. They said that in 2014, about 23 billion US dollar was
Transacting, yeah.
through mobile phone. This is about 42% of
GDP.
of Kenya.
Kenya,
This
yeah,
is very,
it's
very
true.
important.
Mhm.
So I think that technology can bring us to go further than what we are doing now. Thank you again for your participation, and thank you, CEO. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.